Hi, my name is Fabian Fröse. Now let us jump into survey design, beginning with the structure. How should we structure a survey or a questionnaire? What are the different components, and in which order will it make sense to structure your survey? Here I give you just a very rough overview, 3 categories. First, you would start with some kind of introduction and screening. Introduction would be, hello, dear this and that, this survey is about this and that topic. Not going into the details, because respondents should still be able to answer in their own words and should not be biased. And then, maybe, it depends on your survey objectives, you would include some screening questions. Let's assume you would like to conduct a survey on employees working for big companies, and you would contact people more via general, maybe an online survey. Then you would include some screening questions. Do you work for a big company, or what's the size of your company, and so forth. You would include a series of screening questions so that the respondents actually belong to your target sample. So that would be the beginning, introduction and screening. Then the second, which would be the main part. In that part you would try to answer your research question, starting with very often with a dependent variable. So people will always fill it out at the beginning. And second, also, it's more from a research method perspective, if we start with the independent variables first, that may bias respondents. So you would start with dependent variables first, and then the most important questions next, and lesser important questions later. For the very simple reason, respondents might become tired filling out your survey. And then at the end you would also include some other questions that are also part of your research or control variables. And very often third, you would finalize your survey asking about background information. Some of it might be also somewhat sensitive, such as age, gender, demographics. Or maybe also you would ask for contact details, the very last question. So just one, I think that's the overall structure. Assuming you do a cross-sectional, meaning one-time survey only. How long should the survey be? Length of the survey is always a very critical question. As researchers, we would like to have many questions. A very long survey would be great, so we can ask all our questions, including many different types of independent variables, control variables, or other interesting variables we would like to add. That, however, is not really realistic. Respondents don't like such long surveys. So we need to find a compromise. So as short as possible and as long as necessary. And it also depends on various factors. For one, it depends on the respondents. If you would like to survey university students and you're a professor, they're your students, you do it during classroom hours, then it can be longer. It could be very different. If you're on the street, you do a marketing survey, research projects, and you would like to ask passing by people, and then you can't just ask them, please, sorry, I've just 100 questions and 30 minutes I would like to ask you. Probably people will just run away. So you need to keep it very short. It depends on the respondents. And then it also depends on the data collection format. If you collect data, you as a researcher go into the field, you invite people to come to your office, in your laboratory, and they set aside 1 hour and you sit side by side the interviewer or the respondents, then you can have a longer survey. However, if you do an online survey or on the street, you don't have much time, or respondents don't have much time, you need to keep it shorter. So it depends on respondents and data collection. Nevertheless, let's assume you do a typical online survey, or could be also a mail survey. What would be a good length? Based on my own experience, I would say 80 items is a good number. You can put in many items, questions you think that are important for your research, and it's still not that extremely long. 80 items would maybe translate to 15 to 20 minutes time for the respondents to fill out the survey. That's typically or usually doable, but as I said, it's the maximum. It would be much better if the survey would be shorter, 40 to 60 items. If you add 40 to 60, you can still add many important variables. And at the same time, it's not that long. It may be, let's say, 10 minutes, or that's also you can communicate when approaching people. It would take around 10 minutes to fill out the survey. So far, I've talked about the structure and length of a survey, which is important. Let us dive a little more into detail. Preparing questions. How and what kind of questions should we prepare? There's some basic guidelines. First one would be use simple words. Not everyone has a doctorate and uses fancy words. We like to use simple words. Also consider not all respondents are 100% paying attention. So don't make it too difficult. Use simple words and try also to keep it brief. I know some people like very long sentences. It sounds very sophisticated, but it confuses respondents. Simple words and be brief. Next point, also try to avoid ambiguity. It should be very clear. Don't beat around the bush, blah blah blah, this and that. Be very clear. Do you like it? You don't like it? And this and that. Brief and clear. Another point also, some researchers have to be cautious about leading questions. You don't want to bias respondents. We want their honest and immediate response. And we don't want to guide them that they like our product or this and that. For research, we are neutral and we would like to avoid these leading questions. Another problem also would be double barreled questions. That could be, do you like cats and dogs? Yeah, I like cats, but I don't like dogs, or vice versa. That's confusing. So avoid that. Just, do you like dogs? First question. Second question, do you like cats? And then also I would be very cautious with negative wording. Because different languages, different even within the same language, people are not always so sure about it. Don't you know that? Yeah, or don't you mind? It's very confusing. Yeah? And people think, and maybe 1 out of 10 understands in the wrong way. And then that messes up your analysis. So very carefully think about these issues. Some people think, yeah, designing a survey is super easy. I want to find out whether people like dogs, whether like this, and I just come up with this question, that question. Should be brief, simple, okay, that's already good. If you want to do research, I think there's one step further you would like to consider. You would like to use sound scales, sound items that has been used and tested before, that are reliable and maybe also comparable. That would be very important if you're into a scientific research project. And then you would try to use existing questions and scales from the literature. And there's so many constructs and existing scales to measure, such as job satisfaction, commitment, and so forth. Yeah, so it would be always best to use these existing items and scales. Sometimes you might want to use some of these scales and adapt it to a different context. Yeah, because you might be interested in liking dogs and liking this and that, and there exists a scale on something very similar, and then you can take that related scale and then maybe slightly adapt it to your context, and that would be also a very typical and good choice. Or you can take it from a different language, from English, translate it into your own local language, let it be German, Japanese, or whatsoever. Sometimes that's not possible, yeah? Or for some reasons you don't like existing scales, then you can also develop your own scales. If you would like to do that for a research project and you would like to publish in a journal, then there are very high standards expected from you. You would properly develop a scale. I have a video on that, how to do that, and there are many books how to do that, because it's very complicated. That's a major research project in itself, so I usually would say don't do that. It's too much effort, it takes too much energy, so always try to use existing items and scales. Now I would like to give you an overview of different types of questions. There could be open-ended questions. An example here you can see, can you talk about your experience as an expat in Japan? And then the person would just answer, yeah, this and that, blah, blah, and would talk. In contrast, closed-end questions, you don't expect an elaborate answer, you expect yes, no, very much, not much at all, and so forth. An example could be, did you like working as an expat in Japan? 1, like very much. 5, did not like at all. Yeah? So you have a scale then from 1 to 5, a closed-ended question. In surveys, we prefer closed-end questions because that makes it much easier for us to statistically analyze those ones. There are different question types or types of scales. I give you an overview, or you can see, you can have a look here at this table to see an overview of different scales. First, we can start with nominal scale. Nominal scales can be characterized that they have no better or worse, they're different categories, you could say. One example for nominal scale. What is your gender? It could be 1 male and 2 female. And as I mentioned before, there's no better or worse. These are 2 different categories. Then we have ordinal scales. Ordinal scales would be, we have some kind of order. One is higher than the other, but the distance between these between 2 points and the other point are not always equal. Yeah, but we can still determine greater, higher, lower, but 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, the distance between these points are not equal. One example of ordinal scale, a very typical one, is what is your highest level of education? High school would be 1, 2 would be bachelor's degree, 3 master degree, and 4 PhD. And the distance between each of these education levels are difficult to quantify. Not one is the better, it's a higher level of education, but between higher education, high school and bachelor degree and bachelor to master degree, the difference between these points are not really easily quantifiable. Then we have interval scales. Again, we have an order, higher, lower, but the major difference to ordinal scales is that the distance between each point is equal. One example, what's the temperature? And so forth. And then we have ratio scales, somewhat related, but we have now a true zero that exists in reality. Another example of ratio scale, what's your weight? For us to analyze data, interval and ratio scale data are easier to analyze because we can treat them as continuous variables. Nominal or ordinal variables are more complicated. We would probably treat them as categorical variables or as dummy variables. So when designing surveys, if possible, we prefer interval and ratio data. However, that's not always possible because some things in reality are just nominal or ordinal. Now, let us talk about typical challenges and countermeasures. Starting with one very important question. Single versus multiple item scales. So the question is here about how to measure a construct, an underlying construct. Take the example, do you like the restaurant we've just been to? If you just have one question, then you would ask, how did you like the restaurant? And then maybe a Likert scale response, 1 to 5, from not like at all to like a lot. Then it's sometimes difficult to measure exactly. If it's a 4 or 5, that's not so clear. Or do you really like it or not? It could also be, you ask the question, do you like the restaurant? And the other one says, yeah, I like it somewhat. Also polite answer. But then you would ask another question. Would you like to go there again? And then maybe the question, no way, or yes. So then you have already 2 questions, and then you become more accurate at measuring it. And then maybe add another question. Did you like the food? Did you like the atmosphere? Did you like this and that? And becomes a more well-rounded construct to measure the quality or the restaurant. When doing that also, when you combine several items, you increase variance. If you have only one item maybe as a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So the degree of difference is very small, and if you relate this variable to another variable, there's very little difference, very little variance. But you combine, let's say, 4 items, 4 times 5 options, so then you have already many more options, many more answer options, more variance. So you can analyze it much more better. And then also if you have multiple items, you can measure the internal validity of this measure. So meaning a multi-item scale is it's usually superior to a single item measure. There's of course a debate in literature, but if you would also think about these points I just mentioned, or if you would like to publish later on, it's quite clear and well established that we should use multi-item scales. Then the next question is then of course, how many items for one construct? I think if you ask me this question now, I would say 3 to 4 items is great, because sometimes the measure is not very reliable, not very valid. Maybe you need to drop 1 item in this course. So I would say 4 items would be good, 3 items would be also fine. Yeah, of course, the more items, the more variance you have and so forth, but the problem is this survey gets very long and we don't have enough space for such long constructs. Yeah, but then also a former comment I made, you would like to use established existing scales, and then you just take the items from those scales. When we conduct international surveys, there are more challenges. But at the same time, there are also various remedies how we can counter these potential problems. Let me talk about some of the major challenges that we might face. One would be challenge of different languages. Even if you only conduct a survey in one country, very often you would use existing scales and items from English sourced language typically, and you conduct a survey in Japan, in China, in Germany, in Russia and so forth. You would then translate these items into local languages. That's not so easy, because the meanings, the terms can vary substantially across countries. Some terms don't exist in other countries, very simple, and then you describe, or sometimes also the way of writing is very complex, it's difficult to translate. Then in international surveys, another concern are different response styles. To give an example, do you like this and that? Some people are very polite in some countries. They tend to give higher scores. Or some countries, they avoid very high and very low scores. They like to give rather modest answers. When you combine and try to compare then these two different countries, you will probably find some major differences, but not because of the attitudes are so different, it's just the way how people respond. And then we have differences in social desirability. Some people try to please respondents, or what is expected in the survey, or some topics they're sensitive and they try to avoid, and they're very cautious in responding. What can we do then? So there are different strategies. I think whenever you design such an international survey, when you compare different countries, it would be good to consider that already at the design stage. One way would be to invite scholars from these different countries and then design a survey together. One cause of problems is very often negative wording, because don't you do this? Yes, I don't do this, or yes, I do that, can be very different across countries. And you would also like to try to avoid idioms which sometimes don't exist in other countries. What has become common practice is the so-called back translation method. That means the survey gets translated from English into German, and then from one interpreter and another interpreter translated now back from German to English. So in both directions, from different people. And then later you compare the original version with the back translated version. Are these versions very different or slightly different? And then if they're very different, you would check the translated version. But at the end of the day, the translated version should make sense in the local language. Even then, sometimes some adjustment might be necessary. As for response style bias, I mean, there are different ways how to incorporate that at the design stage. Or later, post hoc, then of course you can standardize variables. For social desirability, there are also social desirability scales and items where you will check the degree of social desirability of respondents, and then you can control for that later on. Now, let us talk about data collection. To begin with, let us talk about the nature and size of sample. First, talking about the nature of the sample. We can distinguish between different types of samples. As researchers, we always would like to have a random and representative sample. We conduct a survey on some kind of attitudes, political attitudes in Germany. We would like to randomly sample, let's say, 5,000 or 10,000 respondents. That would be great. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. Because there's limited resources, there are other constraints. So the opposite would be some kind of stratified sample. So where we carefully select certain characteristics or certain regions, certain this and that, and then try to sample respondents accordingly. Another approach, what we see a lot also in smaller research projects, would be simply a convenience sample. I would like to study refugees. There's a refugee shelter in my hometown, so I simply go and ask my friends, or just go there and I find some people and who I can easily survey and contact. Convenience sample. Then another distinction of sample would be maybe student versus field-based sample in psychology, but also sometimes in some management research. Researchers simply survey their own students. In psychology and so forth, that is somewhat acceptable, but in most other management journals we would expect that people really go out into the field and collect surveys from, let's say, managers or employees, people and so forth. So here, as you can see, there's some kind of difference between what would be ideal and what would be feasible. And what is possible. So very often we will find some kind of stratified surveys, but also sometimes convenience sample for our research projects. Then let me now talk about the size of the sample. Because the sample size is very important. Of course, you would like to have large sample sizes, representative large sample sizes. That would allow you to make inferences that your findings are generalizable, and that you can detect true effects based on your sample. And then also, if you have a large sample size, you can conduct any kind of statistical analysis. In contrast, if you have a small sample size, that would limit the number of variables you can include, statistical power and so forth, and then you would have any kinds of restrictions. So ideally, we would like to have representative random samples. That is not very often possible. Instead, we have some kind of stratified or maybe some convenience sample or some mixture of it, and the sample size might be not that big. Nevertheless, at a minimum, I would always recommend a sample size of approximately 200 respondents, because that would allow us to conduct various kinds of multivariate statistical analysis. And about these statistical analysis I will talk in my later videos. Next, let me talk about different data collection means, starting with communication approach. How would you conduct this survey? One option would be via personal interviews. That means the researcher would meet the respondents and then conduct the survey together. It could be aided, so meaning the interviewer asks and fills out the survey for the respondents, or maybe the interviewer or the researcher just sits near or next to the respondents. That has, of course, a big advantage. You have more control, and also you're available if any questions arise. However, that's also very time consuming and not always possible. Another option would be via telephone. Not so common these days, but you're not in Germany, but here also in China and other countries it's still being used quite a bit. In the past we mainly did surveys via sending out letters, snail mail, and then having a pre-postpaid return letter and then receive it back, or fax. Yeah, but fax I think nowadays doesn't really exist anymore. Also letter surveys are not that common, though in Japan we have still used it very successfully recently. Another way would be email or / also intranet. That's now a very common approach. It's also very convenient, particularly if you do it via internet. The advantage is here, you get all the data from, or you can just download it, it's very easy. So from a convenience perspective, also from reaching many respondents, I think nowadays these internet surveys have become extremely common, but that also depends on how you initiate the contact. There are many online panels that you can really simply pay for it, or research agencies, or you can initiate the survey yourself and maybe invite people via intranet or email, and then respondents fill out the online survey. So if we cooperate with companies, we usually do it via intranet or internet, but also we have done many online panels. Next question is then where? The place of the survey, where it's being filled out, if it's at the office of the respondents, or it could be also in the university if you survey students, at home, or maybe a neutral site. That depends on your research objective, your content. In some cases you would like to avoid the office because people might not be able or willing to freely communicate their attitudes about the company, or could be elsewhere. Now we're reaching the end of this video. Let me conclude by emphasizing 2 points. The first one, I would like to emphasize this here, it's extremely important to carefully design your survey. This will then give you the opportunity to collect useful data so that you can analyze it and complete a successful research project. Second, when designing your survey, it will be important to consider your sample and data collection already in the design stage. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you. Bye bye.